again, thanks for joining us for this webinar on deaths in custody, accountability in Pennsylvania jails. I'm really excited for the panelists that we have joining us today, so I'm going to introduce everyone and then we will jump right in. Brittany is an award-winning investigative journalist and educator based in Cleveland, Ohio. She is a staff writer with the Marshall Project Cleveland, and she is the former co-founder and director of the Pittsburgh Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, where she tracked the deaths of those in the custody of the Allegheny County Jail, in addition to investigating how the pandemic has impacted the jail. Joshua Vaughn is an investigative reporter with PennLive. He covers a broad array of criminal justice issues, recently focusing on conditions and abuse in Dauphin County Prison. And finally, Terence Keel is a professor with a split appointment in the University of California, Los Angeles' Department of African American Studies and the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. He's written extensively about race, religion, law, medicine, and life sciences. In 2020, Dr. Keel became the founding director of Biocritical Studies Lab, an interdisciplinary space that combines life science research, the best data of science, and the wisdom of the humanities to explain how discrimination, inequality, and resilience are embodied in vulnerable communities and the societies we design. So again, thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start with a brief overview of the project that Josh and Brittany worked on together. So could you just start by telling us a little bit about how you came to be investigating deaths in Pennsylvania jails, and also how you met Anthony, who you followed throughout your project?
Who wants to take it, me or Josh? Or do you want me to go? I can talk about how we connected, and then if you want to, or we could talk. Okay.
I always feel like your story is way more interesting than my story, because mine just is.
I disagree, but
I started digging into it.
I started to track deaths at the Allegheny County Jail in 2020, which started with Daniel Pastrick, which turned into its own journey. And after I first covered his death and attempted to obtain his autopsy, which then later turned into a court case, I continued on that beat and eventually reported on 21 deaths in the Allegheny County Jail from 2020 to 2023. While doing that, I became Twitter friends with Josh and was noticing and seeing that he was on the same beat where he was burrowing into one county jail and really dedicating a lot of his coverage to making sure that the folks who died behind bars had information. And we basically connected and were like, what would happen if we joined forces? And we went to the Pulitzer Center and said, look, this is happening in Dauphin County. This is happening in Allegheny County. We're not alone. The death tolls are higher in our jurisdictions because we're looking. And what would happen if we looked everywhere, and how could we really quantify what's going on in our state? Josh, do you have anything to add about that?
I think you nailed most of it. I mean, the way that I came to it, I've been covering criminal justice issues for probably the last going on 10 years at this point. I worked at a smaller paper, then I worked at a publication called The Appeal, and then I came to PennLive. Part of what I had been doing at The Appeal was collecting all the deaths in custody reports each quarter to understand how many people were dying of COVID in prisons, not jails at that point in Pennsylvania. And then late 2021, we got the final BJS report, Bureau of Justice Statistics, saying how many people die in county jails based on their survey. And I just knew from looking at the reports that I had from collecting that data from 2020 through 2021 at that point, that there was a significant drop-off in reporting over those years. So I did a story in early 2022 that basically showed that in throwing a lot of numbers, in 2020, our federal data will show that Pennsylvania jails were like the safest they've ever been for people, but the reality is they were actually the most dangerous. More people were dying at a higher rate in jails in 2020, which obviously makes sense because that's exactly what was happening in the community. People were dying at higher rates than ever before, or in quite a long time. But our data was so woefully out of sorts. So I wanted to find out why. And then that got me more onto Dauphin County specifically, and the things that are happening here. And we've kind of had a microcosm of like every bad issue that can happen in a jail has been happening in Dauphin County. But yeah, I mean, Brittany's the rock star. I'm just kind of riding her coattails. She did amazing work that I was in awe of, inspired by for quite some time. So it was great to get to work with her, and it's always a pleasure to get to work with her.
Thanks, Josh, but you're underselling yourself. To answer the second part of the question, though, Josh had been routinely pulling these quarterly records, which are, for those who don't know, the Death in Custody Reporting Act requires jails and prisons to report a in custody death to a state agency, and that state agency turns around and gives that information to the federal government. And anybody can request that record. You can go to your state agency in your state and ask for those quarterly reports. It should be routine. You shouldn't get any pushback for that. And so that's what we were doing. And because I was so burrowed into Pittsburgh, I knew who was missing in those reports. So had we just created a database of just the records that we had received, we would have missed so many people. And actually the main focus of our story, kind of the through line, is Anthony Tallada, who was not included in those records. So his story would have been completely hidden if we only relied on the government data. The reason I knew about Anthony Tallada is like one of the most like kind of gravity moments as a reporter is he's one of the deaths in the Allegheny County Jail that the staff were actually calling me to report. A lot of times it would be the incarcerated who would tell me and give me a name or tell me someone died on this date or go ask the medical examiner this. But when Mr. Tallada died, I had multiple staff members reaching out to me with great concern, and it was really heartbreaking at the time. And I couldn't report it because they were all off record. So we knew about this death for a year. Josh and I start this database, and then Anthony Tallada's family filed a suit. And we were able then to get the records that we weren't able to get before because they had subpoenaed them, and it turned into this whole piece for our story. So that's how he became the focal point for us. Some background on him is that he was a intellectually disabled man who had never been incarcerated prior. He had been in the care of his elderly mother, and after she died, he was in a group home, and the symptoms of his disability made him agitated. Sometimes he could get overwhelmed, and he poured hot water on himself and a caretaker. And for whatever reason, they called the police. We obtained the police report, which the police themselves were saying, I don't think this guy should go to the jail. Like, should we really take him down there? And he was injured with third-degree burns. I can't remember, Josh, now how severe the burns were, but he was injured from the burns. And we then later learned that he had gone back and forth from the hospital. And ultimately, the medical examiner determined that he had died of a heart attack or a cardiac arrest, or his heart had stopped. The family and their lawyers are alleging, like, yes, his heart did stop, but the thing that led up to that was sepsis and medical neglect, and that's what they're parsing out in court right now. So it tells a ton of angles about like this whole journey, and I could get into that, Michaela. I don't know if you want me to, but that's the gist of how we got here and who Anthony Tallada was.
And I mean, I think the Anthony Tallada was just, he highlights so many of the problems with the system, because I mean he wasn't reported, but remembering the reporting now from a couple months ago, but he wasn't reported because they technically released him from custody right before he died. So the jail argues that he was no longer in custody despite, all the circumstances leading up to his death happened in the jail. They got a bail modification, or they got some kind of release for him right before he died. So he's released. So he's not an in custody person anymore. That happens a significant amount. We're talking about potential medical neglect, which happens quite a bit. What I always say, I don't know if we ever get to a point where we have 0 deaths in jail, if we have people in jail, just for the sheer fact of we're human beings. Things happen. But we should be getting to the point where we want to have as little or no preventable deaths. And it's still a ton of preventable deaths whenever we look at it. And something like Talata seems like a case that if just would have been better medical care, that he would still be here.
Definitely. And I want to dive into some of those systemic issues a bit more. But before we get too far down that, Terence, could you just give us a little bit of an introduction of what are the different steps of records that should be disclosed upon someone's death, and also the role of the coroner in all of this, maybe giving us some explanations about an autopsy and what some of the publicly disclosed information from that is, just so we have a good overview as we dive deeper into this.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So, the work that I've been doing in my lab for the last 4 years has been investigating deaths in custody nationally. And in an effort to understand this crisis of in custody death, there are a few things that are really important that help explain some of the challenges that Brittany and Josh experienced, that I also experienced as a researcher, and many other media experience. Currently, right now, there is not any national or federal law that determines if autopsies and death records are publicly available. So there isn't anything in the Constitution. Congress hasn't passed any laws about this. Instead, each state is free to determine if and how members of the public can get access to death records. And what this creates is a real landscape where there's really strange differences from state to state. And even within states, there can be exceptions that are made. And this creates very real challenges for reporters and media, even impacted community, to understand what is a death record, how do I get access to it? And in places like Pennsylvania or places like California, these large states with large multiracial populations, it's not uncommon for law enforcement to do a variety of things that prevent or make access difficult. So for those who are unfamiliar, an autopsy is to be conducted by a medical examiner or a coroner, who are either a licensed physician or someone who has been appointed in the position of a coroner or medical examiner. And the rules for these appointments vary by state by state. Their job is to investigate a death that is mysterious or untimely. Most of us fortunately will not have our bodies examined by a medical examiner or coroner. However, people who die in custody, people who die from violence, people who die unexpectedly from illness and disease, state laws often mandate that these deaths have to be investigated. Now, the thoroughness of this investigation varies from county to county and from state to state. And this is particularly important when it comes to people who are in custody. And in custody in this context means someone who's died while police are trying to arrest or detain somebody, or while someone is a ward of the state in a jail or some carceral facility. Both of those count as in custody deaths. One would assume that a death in custody, whether it's in jail or in the street, would be something that would be fairly easy for a medical examiner to determine how and why someone died. But it turns out that's not the case. And this largely has to do with the fact that the thoroughness of the examinations vary. It is often the case that medical examiners have discretion to complete a total autopsy or a superficial autopsy. So superficial autopsy could mean just an examination of the external parts of the body, so not an internal examination of organs or even blood samples or lab samples. A thorough examination could involve something more detailed, which involves a Y section, removing organs, sending specimens to lab, doing an analysis. There is no federal law that mandates people who die in custody should have a complete autopsy. Instead, this is left to the discretion of coroners and medical examiners. And what that creates are fragmented records. records that are wildly inconsistent, where people are dying in custody, and sometimes they produce reports that are comprehensive, and sometimes they don't. And anyone who's trying to track this information is hamstrung by the decisions medical examiners make. And also, to reiterate Joshua and Brittany's point a little bit earlier, what police decide to release and report. And they can do a variety of things, including putting records on security hold, or simply undercounting people who die in custody. There's been a lot of studies to show that police undercount or misclassify deaths in custody, or release people from their custody before they die.
I just want to double check the one. Is this better? Is the volume better on this mic?
Yeah, you sound great.
Good.
Thanks for that overview. That's really helpful framing as we're moving into this. So a couple of you have all mentioned that there were certain records that are publicly available, easy to obtain, but I know Terence and Brittany, you both have been involved in lawsuits to get other records for public information for your reporting and your research. So could you explain a little bit more about what is publicly classified and what isn't, and where some of those distinctions are made, keeping in mind while we're talking about this, that it does vary state by state and even county by county, it sounds like.
Well, it also varies. Like, I made case law in Pennsylvania and Terence was still denied and had to continue fighting in another county in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, it's, but to preface it, when I started that journey, I talked about Daniel Pastrick, who was a man who died in the Allegheny County Jail on Thanksgiving of 2020. There was like a 4 or 5 sentence story in the Post-Gazette, and I was just incredulous, like, how is this all that there is about this? And at that, prior to that, I had been teaching creative writing in the Allegheny County Jail, and I felt really naive. It didn't occur to me that my students might not survive it. It just kind of like blew me away. And I'm from Maryland, and you can get an autopsy by just sort of asking for it. So when I found out that he had died, I was like, oh, I'll just request this. I mean, and I immediately got pushback and was told no. So I appealed it myself, actually, which is kind of wild that I like made this like kind of argument by myself, because all these different lawyers in Pennsylvania were like, no, good luck. And I'm very stubborn. So I kind of wrote my appeal myself, and the Office of Open Records actually granted it to me. And I was like, whoa. And then the county appealed that to Common Pleas Court. And I was like, okay, I really can't defend myself in Common Pleas Court, which is how I got in touch with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Paula Knudsen-Burke is a rock star. If you are in Pennsylvania and you are a journalist, you should absolutely know who they are. You should also know who they are nationally, but Paula in particular is kind of the patron saint of public records, NPA. So this is a long, convoluted answer, but we ended up appealing, and we went to Commonwealth Court, and the Commonwealth Court said, they're right, this is a public record, and we were finally granted access. So by the time that happened, it was almost 3 years from that initial request, and when Mr. Pastrick died. And when I finally got the records back, like Dr. Keel had mentioned earlier, they didn't do an autopsy, and they did do an external examination, meaning they looked at him and they said heart attack, but they did not do an internal investigation of any kind. And the other thing that's curious about the records that I obtained is that there is no medical examiner's narrative or coroner notes. Most people who look at autopsies know that you have kind of the medical side of it that's very like talking about the biology of things and the body, and then there's a little bit of a narrative of like, okay, this is when the body came in, this is where that person was, we interviewed these people, it's like, what's the context of this, the science. And I was denied actually the narrative part of the autopsy. So we still do not know what happened to Daniel Pastrick outside of this determination that he died of a heart attack by looking at his body. and the one more thing I'll say about that, and then kick it back to Dr. Keel, is that I have since moved to Cleveland, and I can request the autopsy of anyone who dies in the jail, and get it within a couple hours, and it's free. I had to pay, I think it's like $500. It's almost $700 for an autopsy, including the toxicology reports in Pittsburgh for one autopsy, and they're free in Cleveland. And then the other piece of that is I can also get surveillance footage of people who die in jail in Ohio, and we will never get that in Pennsylvania, which is that's a sidebar. But it's just wild to fight so hard for these records for 3 years in Pennsylvania, and then move to a different, just literally an hour away, and we have totally different access and a totally different system in the same country. So that's my spiel. Dr. Keel.
Yeah, I think that's great. I would just add, to burrow down in Pennsylvania. So there, in Halo's case, this is really crucial. There is the right to know law, which provides essentially statewide what records are publicly available and why. But there is another law, the Coroner's Act, which medical examiners at the local level have interpreted as giving the medical examiner, coroner, the discretion to not release death records, with a very forced interpretation that death records are somehow medical records, that they are somehow HIPAA protected. But they are not HIPAA protected insofar as HIPAA applies to people who are currently active and living. Death records in nearly all states don't follow those designations. And these records are written in the public's interest, which is why we have a medical examiner system to begin with, which dates back to English law. When the country was first founded, coroners were designed to investigate untimely deaths, host a public jury, and then determine who and why that person died. And what we're witnessing now is a peeling back of the public nature of this transparency and oversight, where the letter of the law is very clear, but medical examiners and coroners are making other interpretations that make access very difficult, and also producing records that are not of high quality. And of course, as a final point, yes, the financial barriers provide another way to prevent people accessing it. And if you're a low-income family who's trying to decide, do I bury my child? Do I pay for a death record? Chances are you're going to spend the $500 for burying your child and having some sort of closure, which I think is just an unconscionable decision that family members in Pennsylvania have to make.
Yeah, and I mean, the way it's supposed to operate in Pennsylvania is at the beginning. So like the beginning of this year, all of the records from 2023 are supposed to be taken from the coroner's office and deposited into the prothonotary, which is just the office that oversees civil records. And once they're there, it's generally free to go access them. The statute, we have a statute that allows, well, I guess doesn't allow, it requires for 66 out of the 67 counties that it costs $100 for the coroner's narrative, $500 for the autopsy, $100 for the toxicology. But that's only supposed to apply to the records in the possession of the coroner, and generally meant to be the records that are of the current calendar year. So once the calendar year rolls over, everything gets deposited in the prothonotaries, and then anybody who wants to go examine them can go examine them. That's not the way it seems to be working. There was a case a couple years back that I know my news outlet that I was not with at that point had trying to get this sorted out, because coroners were not necessarily putting the records over, and they was determined that they have to provide stuff to the prothonotary. But then after that, what you saw was counties where the coroner would sign an agreement with the prothonotary, where they would just agree that, yeah, they're with the prothonotary, but they're being stored at the coroner's office, or that the coroner would maintain these records. That's still kind of up in the air of whether that's a legal thing to do. It hasn't really been pushed, by understanding, the way that it needs to be pushed. But so you still wind up having to pay hundreds of dollars to get these autopsies that are supposed to be even years old, that are supposed to be generally easy public access, that aren't. And it's cost prohibitive, and it's a fight at times to try to get those records.
What's also the one last thing I'll say in the Pastrick case is, prior to the decision that we got, Pittsburgh was arguing that only family was allowed to access the autopsy. Anybody outside of next of kin was a no. And Mr. Pastrick didn't have next of kin. He was, he struggled with alcoholism, all these things. He lived in and out of homeless shelters. There was no one to claim his body. There was no one asking the question. So had we not changed that case law, literally no one would have been able to access that record, which seems, that was also what became so, I became so incredulous, was like, how can someone in the United States die and no one can access or ask a question about it? I just need to know. It just didn't sit well with me.
Absolutely. And one thing that you said, Dr. Keel, that I just wanted to circle back on. So you mentioned this whole debate over if these records are HIPAA protected. So Brittany, didn't you say earlier that part of the thing that you found was that they were allowing the autopsy reports sometimes to be public records since those were death records, but then the medicals or the coroner's notes or those kind of dialogues that talk about past medical history and things like that, there was some argument that that also could be considered HIPAA information, and that was part of the reason some of those were being held back as well.
They didn't actually get into the HIPAA argument. They weird, which would have been I guess, decent argument to make. They actually just said because the state law says coroner's notes and they are the medical examiner, that didn't count.
Okay.
Like they were playing a kind of semantics game with us.
Right.
And I got the job in Cleveland and I didn't have more lawyers to go take you know what I mean? So it just, we
But-
let it.
But
yeah.
but in the court case that my lab is in the middle of with Chester County, they are making the argument that the discussion of the deceased medical records is HIPAA protected.
Oh, wow.
Fortunately, the judges saw through that argument, and this is a case that I've been working with my postdoctoral fellow Jonah Walters, who's a Pennsylvania native, trying to work through this case. So we've been able to like successfully push up against that argument. But what this does though is it very clearly shows there's not an interest in transparency. If you're going to have a public record that allows the public to follow the important decision making that the medical examiner had to come to determine how this person died, you would want the public to know at least a summary of the medical history, right? We don't want records being written saying that Daniel died of a heart attack and he had no medical history of heart disease, for example, right? We want to be able to see that there's a clear line of reasoning that starts from the record all the way to the death, that we can have some trust. And I think that what we're seeing instead is an effort to not reveal this, which is really eroding the public trust on what these records are really being written for.
Absolutely.
Also, oh, sorry, in Ohio, the Ohio Supreme Court just ruled that cause of death is not public anymore on a data level because it's HIPAA. So that's wild. So we were able to request all the deaths in Ohio for a year, just name and date of birth and location, but we aren't allowed to know the cause of death because that's protected under HIPAA according to Ohio Supreme Court. So you have that, but I could go to the medical examiner separately and go get it. And then in Pennsylvania, it's the inverse. It really is up to whoever makes an argument, I guess.
And again, all this is because Congress has not passed nationwide standards on what information is supposed to be reported, how it's supposed to be reported, and how it's supposed to be publicly disclosed. These things remain determined by the states. And what we're seeing is that the states aren't getting it right. And the public needs help. And I think we need more federal national leadership on this issue.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think I just want to add in that, I mean, we need that larger oversight just in the sheer fact of we need all the data. Like, I'm in Dauphin County and we have 2 to 3 deaths a year. It's a significant amount for a jail our size, but it's going to be, in 1 year, you're going to have a hard time picking out too many patterns of things that are happening because it's only a handful of people. But if you have 60 some deaths from across the state, or we can build this up over years, we can start to see the patterns of what's happening, and that can eventually save lives. If we're looking at the suicide deaths that occur, we can look and see what happened in each one. What were the policies and practices in place across this broad spectrum of deaths? Are there things that were happening that we're seeing that are patterns that could be preventable? If there's medical care, are there things that are happening in this broad group of data that we now have that we wouldn't have if we're only looking at our one small county to see what's happening? We need this comprehensive, and again, not even just in Pennsylvania, nationwide. If you're able to combine all of this, because a lot of these practices are similar from state to state. I mean, we have a lot of the same medical providers in jails from state to state. So there's a lot of stuff that we could learn just from the sheer fact of getting this data and being able to see it in the 1,000-foot view, rather than having to look at each individual case. And I mean, you could be saving lives that way. It doesn't even have to be necessarily putting the blame on anyone, but we need to, you can't see the patterns without having all of the data.
Absolutely. And so on a kind of narrow case focused on the project that you did, you reported that you found about 65 deaths, 40 of which had been reported correctly. So could you walk us through where those spots were that the reporting process broke down, how certain people didn't get reported? What were those kind of key breakdowns in the system that you found in Pennsylvania particularly?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll go through. I can go through
was
the
gonna say,
alphabet
this is a
soup
big
of all the stuff of where stuff is supposed to get reported and all that. So up until the fourth quarter of 2019, the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics used to do their own study of, how many they would send out surveys to counties all across the country, getting back how many people died in the jails, some basic data on what the causes of death were. But at the end of 2019, it was determined that they can't do that anymore under the Deaths in Custody Reporting Act. So it got switched over to the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and there's a whole, I mean, that's a whole just separate argument. Ethan Corey, my colleague from the BL, has a great explainer as to why that happened. But it went from BJS to BJA. BJA is generally the organization within the Department of Justice that administers grant funding for the Department of Justice. So what's supposed to happen is, if these deaths are not properly reported to the federal government, the state can lose up to, I think it's 10% of their federal criminal justice grant funding. When that transition happened, lots of places just fell off. And part of that may be because they just didn't know, because there was not enough outreach to the jails. Part of that may be just, it's extra paperwork that if somebody's not asking me to do it, then I'm not going to do it. And I don't like doing paperwork either. But what we saw was basically in 2020, less than half of all jail deaths in Pennsylvania were reported properly to the federal government. It went up a bit in 2021, and by 2022 we were at 40 out of 65, so we're about 2/3 of all the deaths were reported, but it still meant 1/3 of the deaths were not reported. There's no real enforcement mechanism. The Bureau of Justice Assistance, the way that I've put it publicly several times, is the Bureau of Justice Assistance is basically allergic to using its enforcement mechanisms. I'm not 100% sure if they've ever revoked federal grant funding for any of the programs. That's kind of their enforcement mechanism for a bunch of the federal oversight programs. And I'm not sure they've ever actually used that. But beyond just the federal level, then we have the state level. All deaths are supposed to be reported to the Department of Corrections, which we then get in aggregate data at the middle of the following year from the Department of Corrections. It was about 50 to 55 that were reported to the Department of Corrections in aggregate. We don't have names. We don't have any of that stuff. It's just number, cause, manner of death, not cause of death. So we have a number of by manner of death. from the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections really doesn't have any enforcement mechanism written in the law to actually do anything about failing to report. And on the website, when they post the data, it basically just says, this is the data we received from the counties. We're putting it out. We don't do anything to verify that it's accurate. All right, there's a bunch of different points where it kind of falls off. One of them that we talked about, that people will get released from custody just prior to death. I had one case in 2020 where a guy was found hanging in his cell on a Wednesday. By the Thursday morning at 9 a.m., he was released from custody. His bail was modified. He was given a medical furlough at 9 o'clock on a Thursday. By 3 o'clock on Thursday, he was dead in the jail. Argues that no one has died in their jail. He didn't die in the jail. He was not an in-custody death, and no one has died in the jail in the last 5 years. We've had a few of those in Dauphin County where things, Ishmael Thompson is one that comes to mind. He got into an altercation with guards, was pepper sprayed, spit hooded, and put in a restraint chair, goes into cardiac arrest within a couple minutes of all that, never recovers, is in a coma for a couple days, and then is basically found to be brain dead. But the fact in those intervening days, his bail was modified to unsecured. So he was just considered not in custody anymore at the time of death. And again, the Bureau of Justice Assistance hasn't provided a good explanation as to what is an in custody death. That they give this kind of vague language of, if other than the medical condition, would the person be if the person would still be in custody, then it counts as an in custody death. Which, I mean, I think my reading of it is, if you bailed the person out because they were dying, then yeah, they would have been there otherwise. But the argument then becomes, well, they wouldn't have actually returned to the jail because their bail was modified to unsecured or ROR. So technically they wouldn't have gone back to the jail if they had pulled out of it. And then you also run into, just for whatever reason, lack of reporting, either again because don't know, it falls through the cracks, they forget to do it, choose not to do it. There just is very little enforcement around actually making sure that this data is actually being submitted and done properly. So what you wind up with is like Philadelphia winds up with this very, very large number reported. And I mean, they have the largest number of people incarcerated, but they're fairly good at reporting all of their deaths. So you get a relatively accurate count. And then lots of other places you get, to varying degrees. It's hard to say just from our database which ones like are not reporting properly, because like there are small counties where like you're just not going to have any deaths. They just maybe not, they didn't have any this year. It's just hard to tell then, because we don't know. And there's lots of different ways to get out of, or to avoid reporting the deaths when they happen, and very little oversight to make sure that they are actually getting reported properly.
Thank you.
So,
I think
yeah.
No, it's very helpful to walk through all the steps in the system there, knowing that it can break down in a lot of different areas.
But I can say just on that, not to take up too much of the conversation, but I mean, one of the ways that we had to try to get around that was we would get they're called extraordinary occurrence reports. Lots of different things count as an extraordinary occurrence: use of force, shackling a pregnant incarcerated person, all sorts of things. Deaths count as extraordinary occurrence reports. And one that at least we found in several counties will get documented is people being released while in the hospital. So we were able to get those. There was a bit of a fight with Dauphin County to get those. We had to go through the Office of Open Records to get Dauphin County to hand over those, but that kind of set the tone that those records are public, that we can get the name, that would give us the names and the dates of when people are released from custody while they're in the hospital. But then you have to backtrack those names. We use 911 dispatch data to try to figure out where and when were there significant incidents, cardiac arrest, that kind of stuff, that would give us another place to kind of look around to see if something happened on that date. But I mean, it wound up having to be trying to understand the way this process plays out to then figure out what are the data points that we can get at to try to act as a proxy and then get us a little bit closer to figuring out, are there people here that we need to find the names of?
And I mean, too, part of it was just having a maniacal obsession with a place. Like, I mean, some of, I teach journalism, and I've had, after I've left, different people be like, how do you do it? How can we? And it's like, you have to be embedded in this place for this long to get phone calls from people who are inside the jail. Like, some of it literally was because the incarcerated called us or the family reached out to us, and there's no real magic paperwork combination that you can do. If the government doesn't want to report something to you, you have to rely on folks calling you and embedding yourself in a community. And that makes you think, like, how many people are we missing? How many people are in a town where there isn't someone they trust or a journalist looking into something, and they don't know that necessarily what's happened is an in custody death, and that they are allowed to ask questions and they are allowed to question it and look for answers. So it's a really, like, a mess. for
Yeah,
lack
yeah,
of a better
yeah.
description.
And if I could add something that ties together what Brittany and Joshua just said, listeners might be thinking, well, is there a universal record of death in custody somewhere in the United States that has a comprehensive list of everyone who's died in custody? And the answer is no, there is not. There is not a single freestanding record that could allow you to tell with precise accuracy how many people died in custody in 1996 or 2017. And so without that, what often researchers and media are doing is the work that Joshua and Brittany are doing, which is being embedded, having conversations with inmates, trying to do the great investigative journalism for the jail environment, which you would imagine the jail environment would be probably the most transparent, because every aspect of someone incarcerated is controlled, right? So what they eat, what they drink, when they sleep, who they visit, what medications they take or don't take, why not the records? So that's partly because they control what records are released. It's even worse when you deal with people who die in custody during arrests on the streets. And it's in those cases that what we're finding is that a lot of people, myself included, are turning to crowd-based data. So these are data sets that are produced by journalists who are arriving on the scene during these deaths that take place on the streets and reporting about this, or people who are releasing information about things that then are later investigated. And what you have happening actually is that the public records, things that are produced not by state agencies, are often more helpful than the state produced records. And I think what we're witnessing here is that the crisis has gotten so bad that everyday citizens, media, people who are invested in these issues are stepping up and filling in the gaps where our government records should actually be providing information for us.
And I see this comment here in the chat. I would imagine that there's a lot of similar circumstances, as you mentioned, in detention centers and such, with the lack of reporting as well, and similar tactics.
Yes, because law enforcement are trained in similar places and they get the same kind of mandates about disclosure, transparency, et cetera. And those law enforcement officers are appointed in ISIS detention centers, are appointed in county jails. They're appointed in all these places. And in some states, they're even promoted to then be people who patrol the streets. And so you get this circulation of police who work in the jails and the carceral environment, and then they work in the streets, and they carry with them the same kinds of practices of lack of disclosure and a kind of resistance or allergy to transparency and oversight.
And two, with migrant detention centers, a lot of them are privatized. You have a private company running these places. So imagine, like, we can at least still right to know and FOIA a government run agency. If they're private, you really can't do much. So, and then another layer is that you have families who maybe don't speak English, who aren't even in this country. So you have a lot of layers to get through with that type of incarceration. And it really is a huge question mark. That's probably I would say the biggest black box we have is our immigration detention centers, I would guess.
I'm seeing the other question in here asking if there are states that mandate death reviews. My understanding is, yes, there are what Texas, I believe, requires a death panel, a death review panel after an in custody death. Pennsylvania, there's a bill in the Pennsylvania Senate right now that would do that along with strengthen the reporting on deaths in custody, make it I believe it's basically, it follows the Texas law, makes it a misdemeanor if you choose and fail to report deaths in custody properly. Creates a death in custody panel, and there's a couple other things that the bill does to try to strengthen deaths in custody reporting. Terrence, you know of it, or but
Yeah, I
you know
do.
of states?
Yeah, California just recently instituted the death in custody reporting officer. This is going to be a gubernatorial appointment that will be for 6 years, and they will have jurisdiction over deaths that take place in all county jails, and they will act as a secondary review or oversight, which is important because there's so much on the line here, and the sort of death investigation is not subject to a peer review system, which is pretty astonishing. Like when media publish things or academics publish things, there is a series of reviews that have to happen and fact checking. When it comes to death in custody, that is not the case, and we're just beginning to see states do things. I was involved in some efforts working with local organizations based out of DC and Baltimore for a Death in Custody Transparency Act that currently the version of the bill that was passed into law will provide a secondary review for all deaths that take place in jails that are classified as homicide. It's not as nearly as comprehensive as we would like, because most deaths in jails are not homicide, they're natural or undetermined, but it's a step in the right direction to create what really we need, a secondary independent body that reviews all deaths in custody. Even if that is a report that's produced by the county, there needs to be some other entity, whether it's staffed by civilians or media or academic experts, to really figure out what's going on and whether or not we agree with how the manner and cause of death was arrived at.
Audience members, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A feature or in the chat. I've got a few more, but just want to note that we will be nearing the end of our time sooner than I can believe, honestly. But so on that note, that leads right into a question that I had, which was, what are some of the systemic reforms that we think could be addressing these issues throughout all of your research and your investigative work? What are some of like your key takeaways or hopes that you would see for reforms to try to keep some of this in a more regulated manner, to be able to track things more appropriately and hopefully with less labor? Because I that's something that's been sticking out to me as you all talk about this, is it's a very time intensive process for journalists and researchers to be investigating and trying to piecemeal these records together. Which, as Brittany said, then it just takes having an advocate in the community and the time and dedication to be able to do it. So what are some of those other systemic reforms that you might be hoping to see on a larger scale?
Well, the other lawsuit I have is that we sued Yale Law Center and the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, sued Allegheny County and the jail on First Amendment claims because we had obtained a policy that barred employees from talking to the press. And that Anthony Tallada piece, to bring it back, I had known about him for a year, but I was sworn I couldn't reveal my sources or report on it because my sources were going to lose their jobs. And now they are protected. We won that case. They've changed the media policy that they are protected to talk to the media, because it is a violation of their First Amendment. And if you, it's called prior restraint. Basically, you're stopping someone from whistleblowing or expressing concern or sharing information before they can even do anything about it. So the Society of Professional Journalists is very excited about this case. They're encouraging journalists to try and obtain policy from any government agency or entity that you are reporting on. Figure out, do they have a policy that bans their employees from talking to you? And that's actually a violation of their First Amendment. So you are allowed to talk to people who work in the government, and they're allowed to talk to you. So that's one of those things that we've been really working on and trying to explain to people, is that this and we won. So ask that question and get that report and file that lawsuit if you need to.
Um, I think something simple to start is just that there's some kind of enforcement mechanism to the reporting. Um, Again, it it's tough to know because there just is very little government required to there's very little enforcement to make sure that this data is accurate. So just at this point, just something that provides a bit more compelling to make sure that we're getting the data when it's supposed to, getting all the data that we should be getting would be great.
If I could add to that, and I see there's a comment in the chat that seems to draw our attention to the fact that there is an in custody death review. But when we discuss review, at least in this panel, what we're talking about is something that's in addition to a death investigation that should be mandated, right? So I think we're going to find ourselves in the best position if we have a established government body whose job it is, I think by legal mandate, to investigate all deaths that take place in custody. And then in addition to that, a third freestanding investigative body that reviews those official records. Right now, we only have one of those systems, and that is medical examiners and coroners being mandated to do an investigation, but the thoroughness of that investigation varies pretty widely. Again, in the case of Daniel Pasternak, there was not an internal examination of his heart, even though they claimed that he died of heart disease. So how can you arrive to that determination if you never bother to look at the organs? So there's a lot of discretion given to medical examiners that I think would be revealed as problematic if there was a secondary body that reviewed their work. And right now, the work of Brittany and Joshua and myself and a few others are the ones doing all this. I would say also, quite frankly, the literature is very clear. People in jail are dying and they should not be dying. And a great number of people who are in jail for things that they should not be incarcerated for. So these are people who are dealing with substance abuse issues, mental health issues that are untreated, people who are unhoused. And there's been a lot of work in places like Los Angeles, which has the largest policing and carceral system on the planet, that many people could still be alive and not be in jail if they were jail diversion programs. So people dealing with substance abuse issues, putting them into facilities where they can actually detox in a healthy way with medical providers who are trained to deal with that. Providing just more beds for people who are unhoused so that they're not being cited for solicitation violations, and then those citations tally and they have to go to jail and they can't bail themselves out, for example. These are the kinds of things that we should not be spending money incarcerating these people for these kinds of offenses. There are other better solutions. So I think if we can minimize contact with police and law enforcement, that saves lives.
I'd also,
Sorry, go ahead, Brittany.
to point out in the Pennsylvania code that has been linked, item I says immediate notification of the coroner and appropriate law enforcement agency by the prison administrator when an inmate dies within the prison, on prison property, or while in custody of prison staff. And Josh and I found out over and over again that they are releasing people from custody on their deathbed to avoid reporting. So that is something that we saw over and over again. And I can't say why they're doing it. I don't know. I can't ascertain motivation of anyone, but we do see that folks will be released on their deathbed from custody and then not reported.
Yeah, and again, that as I said, there may be lots of reasons. I mean, one obviously is just the fact that if they're in custody, that there's potentially guards around, and I know that's one of the things that I've heard. But just the fact that they are released doesn't mean that they can't be reported. They still could be. They still could be reported as death in custody when it happens like that. The other thing that I'd say, like, it's not necessarily like a systemic, like we can legislate, but like we need a systemic, more of an attention paid on, and I know this is something that Terence's lab does a lot of it, more systemic view on the coroners and caring about those offices and those races. And I mean, a big part of they're an independently elected office in Pennsylvania. They should be acting as, if the system is working the way it's supposed to, they should be acting as an independent check on the other parts of our local government. That's the whole point of having them be independently elected people. Only only responsible to the constituents, not to anyone else in the county government, not to anyone running the jail, not to the commissioners, not to any of those groups. So we need to be paying attention to those races as media, paying more attention, getting people to understand that these are important races that we're paying attention to, not just down ballot. This is the guy who has been in the office for decades, or is the guy that we know the name of, so we're going to put him back in the office, man or woman back into office. Like, these are important offices that we need to be paying attention to, just for the sheer fact of how much power they have in oversight.
There are a lot of interesting questions in this chat. But Gail Groves is bringing up an interesting, I don't know the answer to that. That does not sound, that sounds not great. I don't know if maybe reaching out to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press just about that. I know that that's not really a press question, but I've never heard of having to submit before you can. Is it only the jail questions that you have to submit ahead of time? That's kind of strange. But I don't know.
It sounds like it's kind of a similar policy that people aren't allowed to just talk. They have to, you have to submit to the commissioners or the county spokesperson to try to get an answer.
That does sound
I mean,
like restraint to me, but
that's the way we operate in Dauphin County. I've not gotten the policy per se, but that's the way things seem to work here. Is people don't want to talk because they'll risk their job if they do come forward.
you should ask for their policy. Ask them to give it to you.
I think I have an RTK in for that right now. I've got so many RTKs in. I think that's one.
No,
of them
I'm saying this jail person should also request their
Yes.
policy. Be like, give it to me in writing, and then you're off to the races.
Yeah. What else? What other questions are in here?
If I, while we're digging the questions, if I could just add, I think what worries me is so often we think of people in jail or in custody as the other, someone else who, fortunately, it's not me. It's not someone that I should care about. And what worries me is that if you just step back and tally how the system operates such that law enforcement who have legal immunity, who can take people's lives and not be held accountable for it, whether that's in a street or in a jail system. In addition to that, when people die under their watch, there's a medical examiner coroner system that isn't telling us the truth about why these people are dying. And then if you want to get records about these deaths, there's all these obstacles to getting these records. So when you tally that up, it's a system that can take people's life and be held completely not accountable for it. That's a terrifying system. And it's a system that under those circumstances, anyone can be caught up in these and sort of the brutality of all this. I mean, any one of us can have a bad day and find ourselves in jail or find ourselves confronting law enforcement. And if there's not a mechanism to have oversight on how these institutions operate, I think that we are in some real trouble. And so I think when there's smoke, there's fire. And I think the work that Brittany and Joshua are doing is showing us that there's a real fire happening in Pennsylvania and other parts of the country that we need to be paying attention to while we can still deal with the issue. And I think if it grows in magnitude, then we're going to be in some real trouble.
Yeah. And I think Eileen had a question. Would a judge have to sign off on those? Yeah, I mean, they do. Just from observation, there tends to be a lot of deference to, especially if the district attorney's office and the defense attorney are on board for it, that they'll sign off on it. And once the person is released from custody, they are no longer on the jails. The county is no longer on the hook to pay the cost of it. So that's obviously something that we see other places. There's been some incredible reporting, I think, out of Florida on some of the things that the sheriffs down there have done to release people, to get them off the books and then just drag them right back in after they're healthy enough. But then you wind up with this massive medical bill. But once they're released, they're no longer, if they're in custody, then the bill is on the county. If they're out of custody, it's no longer on the county.
Well, I am mindful of our time here. I see that Josh and Brittany shared their emails in the chat, so I'm seeing some of these questions specifically about Pennsylvania. I would encourage you all to reach out, continue to follow up. I know in our previous discussions, the three of you all talked about how important collaboration was to being able to do this work, to staying in touch with other people who are doing this work, getting answers, getting advice, because it's so tricky to navigate. So would definitely encourage you to stay in touch, try to expand your networks, because this work is really important, as we're all seeing. And as Dr. Keel kind of mentioned, it doesn't discriminate. It affects everyone. Everyone of all races, genders, ages are dying in prisons. So important for us to be taking a look and really investigating those systems.
Yeah,
So
Tom Reese, I see your question. It's more convoluted, but if you email me, I will get back to you. Sorry to cut you off, Michaela.
no, you're good. So like I mentioned, this is recorded and we will be sending it out to all of you after. So in the spirit of collaboration, forward it along to your networks. We want to make this information as publicly accessible as possible to help everyone out who is doing this work. So and as you are continuing in your journeys, please stay in touch with the Pulitzer Center as well. We're doing a lot of work on criminal justice issues and human rights more broadly. And so encourage you to take a look at our website, take a look at some of the other reporting and resources that we have listed there. And then finally, as I mentioned at the start, we have a brief survey that'll pop up at the end of this webinar. We'd appreciate if you take just a minute, give us any of your thoughts and feedback so we can continue to improve our events. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you three so much. Really insightful to hear from you. My cat thinks it's dinner time. So I will let you
Well,
all
it's
go.
quietly eroding under me, and I'm yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for the
everyone.
conversation.
Thank you, guys.